Premier Smith was warmly greeted by the crowd. They love her. And even the separatists think she's a perfectly fine caretaker of the province until we leave. But every time Alberta's role within a united Canada was mentioned, the crowd booed. And, you know, I don't even think they're booing Canada specifically, but the treatment of Alberta within Confederation. But if you got all your news from the mainstream media, you would hear they were booing Premier Smith. They most definitely weren't. But there was this cute... Sorry, go ahead.
Oh, and let me guess, Sheila, the mainstream media, they never picked up on that nuance, did they?
I don't think they cared about the nuance. I think
they chose to ignore it.
Yeah, because they specifically ignored the rousing applause she got and the support that she got from the members. Again, the separatism was a huge issue at the AGM. And again, we'll talk more about it tomorrow. They got involved in the UCP board elections. I think all but 3 people who won board positions were APP, Alberta Prosperity Project selected candidates. So it's a big deal. It's something that's happening and being mainstreamed within the party. But we'll talk about that more tomorrow. But there was this cute moment where the premier got to say goodbye to her adversary in federal cabinet. And that was, of course, Steven Guilbeault, who the premier makes no bones about not liking. And she got the last laugh on him. So let's show that clip.
Together we have stopped and driven back the extreme anti-energy movement in our country. We have helped to turn the tide of national public opinion from being anti-oil and gas into a country-wide consensus that Alberta's energy resources are a national treasure that can and must be developed. Those who had opposed us, including the former Prime Minister Justin Trudeau and his governing partner, the former federal NDP leader Jagmeet Singh, along with so many others who sought Alberta's economic demise, they've seen their political careers come to an abrupt and dramatic end. Including, I would add, former Trudeau Environment Minister Steven Guilbeault. He, of course, resigned from cabinet on Thursday after the announcement of the new energy deal that repealed several of the anti-Alberta laws that he created. On behalf of all Albertans, Monsieur Guilbeault, we bid you adieu.
You know, Sheila, I like to be right, but I would love to be proven wrong. And I think, you know, even with this resignation of Steven Guilbeault, are we talking about political kabuki theater 3D chess here, that this is all for show? Yep. That he knows, as do a lot of observers, that is this pipeline ever going to materialize, at least in my lifetime? Because Sheila, I'm so sorry, I'll believe this deal, I'll believe this memorandum of understanding is legit when I see shovels in the ground. When is that going to happen? Before or after 2040? In which case, I'm probably not alive, or Ezra's probably put me out to pasture or something. But what are your thoughts?
Right. We'll have people building that pipeline that are in elementary school if that pipeline ever gets built. Yeah. And I did ask the premier about that. I don't know if we want to show that, but I did. I mean, the premier gave her speech, and I like Premier Smith. I'm cheering for her to succeed. But I can read that MOU very clearly. And the burdens it places on Alberta in return for potentially nothing will act as a deterrent to any investment in any potential pipeline. When the Premier says that this MOU has resulted in the repealing of, you know, like the No More Pipelines ban, the tanker ban, the tanker ban is only repealed if we get a pipeline to Tidewater. The pipeline ban still sits in place, and it allows Alaskan tankers to come down the coast when Canadian tankers can't. And so I guess there will be carve-outs for a pipeline if a pipeline ever gets built, but there's nothing legally binding the feds to meet their constitutional obligations to be a functional confederation where our resources can get to Tidewater. And we know that BC is already saying, well, we're launching a lawsuit, so forget it. Go ahead.
And Sheila, thank you for the very important note that this so-called tanker ban, whenever anyone says that there should be an asterisk next to it, because there are tankers every day going up and down that coast. And when Premier Eby says we have to protect the fishing industry, responsible for thousands of jobs. We have to protect tourism because, you know, beautiful BC ain't so beautiful when there's a giant oil slick in the bay. He is not telling the entire truth. There are already tankers every day going through those straits. So I don't know why he gets a free pass on this with the mainstream media, Sheila.
And I hate this MOU because what it does is it takes away the conservative argument that the feds are rightly hammering every day, that a carbon tax is a carbon tax is a carbon tax. It will ultimately be passed along to the consumer, and it acts as a disincentive to investment. And I asked the Premier about that. We don't need to show her a whole reply to me because I thought it was kind of political, because it is a very, well, we'll show my question. It's a very basic question. No one else is doing this. Why would anybody invest here?
Smith, I want to ask you about the increase in the industrial carbon tax in the MOU. It's something that the federal Conservatives say is a deterrent to investment. I think our competitors internationally also feel it's a deterrent to investment. OPEC doesn't have it, Russia doesn't have it, the United States doesn't have it, of course. Brookfield is heavily invested in pipelines in other parts of the world. How do you reconcile that with encouraging pipeline investment to Alberta? Is there a private sector pipeline company that is even floating the notion of investing in Alberta?
Well, I'll deal with those in two parts. So I guess the first one I would say is we negotiated a decrease to the carbon tax because it was slated to go up to $170 by 2030. And we persuaded the Prime Minister that that was just going to be crushing to our industry and we needed to moderate that. And so we had frozen it to send a message that we just didn't think it could go up at that rate. And now we'll have a negotiation to see how quickly we get to 130 and what factors we would look at. I would encourage you maybe to talk to the to private industry because we've had an industrial carbon price since 2007. And you've got a number of companies that are investing in emissions reduction technologies who need a certain carbon price to make that worthwhile. And then you've got other companies who are payers.
So anyway, she goes on to say, you know, the industry is already factoring in the crushing industrial carbon tax into their businesses. But what's missing there is the explanation that a lot of these, the big five, as they call them, the oil and gas companies, Cenovus, CNRL, and some of the other majors, they get a lot of money for their Pathways Alliance net zero projects. It's a carbon capture stuff. So they get a lot of government money. So their government subsidies for this magic beans of carbon capture, it depends on their support of the industrial carbon tax. So, I mean, these are the same big five who stood behind Rachel Notley and said, yeah, give us a carbon tax in 2015. And then Murray Edwards of CNRL jetted off to his I think he has a castle in London. So, you know, it's real easy to say the little people can afford that carbon tax from your castle in London.
But you know what? Speaking of little people and big people, Sheila, you know what would make me a true believer in this pipeline? And that would be an announcement that some company affiliated with Brookfield Asset Management is going to play a role in the development. When I hear that, then I'm going to say all systems are go, because I really think the way this country's being run, it's what's good for Brookfield is good for Canada.
I'm glad you brought that up.
Pardon?
I'm very glad you brought that up because, of course, Mark Carney is bragging about a 6 times increase in the industrial carbon tax, because of course that will result in nobody looking at Canada and saying that's the place I want to invest in, because that protects as I was pointing out, Brookfield's pipeline assets in other parts of the world. The Brookfield is already invested in American pipelines. I think they've got a pipeline in South America somewhere. So it is in Brookfield's best interest to see that a pipeline never gets built in Canada. And they're doing that through the increased industrial carbon tax. No, like if you are looking at the United States with no industrial carbon tax and Donald Trump's ethos of drill, baby, drill, or the values manifesto prime minister with a 6 times increase in already a deterrent to investment, where would you go?
Oh, 100%.
And even if you have specialized technology, say you're a shale producer, the Bakken Shale in southern Saskatchewan is also shared with North Dakota. It's real easy to just invest in North Dakota as opposed to Saskatchewan.
Well, the proof is in the pudding, because correct me if I'm wrong, Sheila, isn't Brookfield involved? I think it's called the Colonial Pipeline in the U.S.?
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah,
exactly. So any prohibition or deterrent to investment in Canada props up the Colonial Pipeline. And that was kind of the point I was making to the Premier.
Aren't there Brookfield companies that are involved in the technology, which is in the billions, I understand, for decarbonization of oil? So,
as if there's such a thing, the decarbonization of oil, but they're also heavily involved in small nuclear reactors. So every time I see Scott Moe pushing small nuclear, I'm like, oh, you mean you're pushing, more money in Mark Carney's pockets, although Mark Carney will say it's in a blind trust. I don't know what it's there. You were in charge of the company. You don't know what it's doing. Give me a break. You can't you didn't put your money in a blind trust and then get stricken with amnesia. Okay. You know what's there and what the money's doing. Yeah. Let's move ahead though, because we've got a lot to talk about. We want to talk about the vicious assault on our team in Quebec after the break. But, our premier sort of poked fun at her nemesis, evil Harry Potter. He's got that evil Harry Potter haircut, Steven Guilbeault. And he took his scalded butt cheeks and he went on Toulamont on Parle, I think it was last night, and said that it was incomprehensible that Premier Smith was elected. And then he decried the loss of green tech jobs that didn't exist. He said, they lost 5,000 to 10,000 green tech. Where did we lose them? I know when people get laid off in the oil field, those are very real jobs that are lost, but green tech that just went missing in Alberta, it didn't happen. He'll complain about an announcement that Premier Smith made that said that green tech investments like wind turbines and solar panels, they have to meet the same rigorous environmental standards as the oil field does. And so they said, oh, we can't. Well, no, we won't be doing that. Thank you. So we just won't invest in Alberta. They're going to make us do environmentalist, protectionist things in Alberta like they do in the oil field. We just won't invest. And he cried about that on Toulamont on Parle. This is a bitter, sad man. And I love to see it. I love to see when bad things happen to bad people. I know it doesn't make me a good Christian, but his butthurtery in this is just filling up the old tank for the week for me.
Vous aviez dit à l'époque que l'Alberta était le leader des investissements dans les énergies renouvelables. Qu'est-ce qui fait que le vent a tourné?
L'élection de Danielle Smith comme première ministre de l'Alberta, c'est incompréhensible. Et pour des raisons essentiellement idéologiques, elle a mis en place un moratoire sur les énergies renouvelables en Alberta. Yeah. Ça représentait des milliards de dollars d'investissement. No. Ils ont perdu 5 à 10 000 emplois presque du jour au lendemain. Tout ça parce qu'elle a dit, moi, je ne crois pas à ça, les énergies renouvelables, même s'il y avait beaucoup d'argent, presque... À ce moment-là, c'était plus de la moitié des investissements en énergie renouvelable qui se faisaient partout au pays, se faisaient en Alberta, dans sa province. Puis elle a dit, moi, je mets un moratoire là-dessus. C'est de la folie furieuse. Ouais. Puis nous, pour lui faire plaisir à cette dame-là qui sera jamais contente, parce que là, on a fait ça. Puis là, on se donne 2-3 mois, puis elle va dire, j'en veux plus, puis j'en veux plus. c'est pas un partenaire fiable, à mon avis, dans cette négociation-là.
She's not a reliable partner. That duplicitous snake, Mark Carney, walked out of that press signing with the premier because he didn't go to the press conference on the MOU. He walked out of there, immediately sent a press release saying, yeah, this MOU is basically great, but it doesn't go ahead without the cooperation of British Columbia, thus giving them a veto. I asked about that in the press conference, and the premier said, well, the MOU doesn't give them a veto. Yeah, I know, but the premier or the prime minister keeps talking about it, so we need to address that gorilla in the room. But he's so sad that his green slush friends weren't able to flood Alberta with federally subsidized companies to further corrupt our electricity grid, because we have 800 years of clean burning coal under our feet, and yet we experience brownouts because of the early phase out of coal and the adoption of unreliable green energy.